we have time, we can pick up some questions from you as well, because I think it's very nice that what Kuhn indicated of broadening the field and including publics in a broad way nicely come back in the perspective of the Democs game.
Okay, right. Well, this is from both myself and my wife, Anne Bruce, who is also a partner in the project and is away in Skye at the moment, so she is online now. This should be the green button. Yeah, right. We decided in the project to have actually engaging with publics, and the idea of trying to ask people, well, what do you think about selective breeding, and what should be the priorities in terms of where cattle should go in the future? Obviously against a context where people are concerned about should we be eating meat at all and questions like that. But we wrote this Democs card game, which follows some 20 years of use of this as a tool in various controversial areas. We wrote a game, Anne and I between us, and we finalized it a year or two back. We played about 20 games of it, and the primary purpose is just simply to engage publics to discuss an issue which, as Kern and Frank have both said, is not something which is much considered in public. It's much less in the forefront compared with, say, genetic modification. But it's not about collecting the sort of data you'd get out of a statistical survey and so forth, because you're getting groups of people wherever they arise, and they're going to have biases of their own groups. If you eventually play enough games, then you hopefully will smooth out the biases. So there's a health warning with such data as I'm going to present of this to say, don't treat this as being, this is what the European population thinks. This is just simply what the people we talked to have said so far. So the game is as laid out on this particular slide in a sets of cards which are discussed by the players, a group of 6 to 8 people, and somebody is acting as dealer who has at least read the instructions but need not know anything at all about the subject, so long as they sort of follow through the game. And so there are different sorts of cards that are discussed. The card types. First of all, we have what are called story cards. And here we have 8 imaginary people who are involved in or affected by cattle breeding. And everyone has one of these cards, and they read it aloud sort of to the group in turn, so everyone gets to hear all the stories. And the idea here is these stories represent people involved, but all of them have some sort of ethical dilemma at the end of it. Then we have information cards, these things here, and here are about 36 cards with a small amount of information in each one. Everyone is dealt a hand of cards and will get perhaps 6 or 7 in their hand, and the dealer says, read them to yourself and then choose 1 or 2 that you want to share with the group, and when your turn comes, read them out loud and say why you chose them and lay them on the table in front of you. And these are basic things about animal production and a whole range of basic issues. But the issue cards are the next phase, where you're looking at the social and ethical implications from different viewpoints. We get about 40 of these. And you do exactly the same thing. You have a hand of cards, choose 2, put them on the table, the 2 you've chosen, and say, why do you choose them? And automatically that starts a discussion going. And then that leads to certain topics will be coming up, and later on in the game, the dealer will say, can we begin to get our ideas together in the form of making some statements which you write down on what are called cluster cards, which is these things, and that can be a statement about anything you like. The idea is to try to get a group consensus if you can. Not a forced consensus, and if you have 2 opposing views, well, you have 2 cards saying it. It's entirely up to the group. The idea is to be really democratic about this. And finally, you have the chance to vote individually on voting sheets on a set of questions that I'll show you in a moment. So those are the different outputs from the game. Story cards, we've got 8 different types of people. There's a genomics researcher who's doing exactly the sort of work you are doing. There's a cattle breeding cooperative, the leader of which he's trying to work out priorities, or thinking, I've got to think 10 years ahead. So how do you decide now? There is an alpine farmer who's producing traditional artisanal cheese, and he wants to improve the efficiency of it. There is a climate scientist who is trying to advise the government about methane emissions and is explaining the complexity of how on earth you calculate what comes out from cattle and the whole idea of agriculture as a whole. There is an environmentalist who really thinks we should be moving towards pasture-fed cattle and really away from intensive production, but also says if farmers are going to get farmers should get credit if they're doing environmental advantages, rather than just having to do it off their own sort of grace, as it were. There's a vet, and we have also somebody researching the hornless dairy cattle using genome editing, because we wanted to introduce genome editing into the subject, because it's there on the agenda, even if it isn't a major part of BovReg. And lastly, a consumer thinking, I really, really would like to be a good ethical consumer, but I'm also worried about the budget. So those are our different cards on the stories. I'm not going to go into the same detail on the information cards, but we are trying basically to say, I assume people don't even know the difference between intensive and extensive agriculture. So one has to explain some very basic things, or even between dairy and beef and mixed breeds. So it's really, really basic you have to go back to. And in the issue cards, we're trying to address a whole range of questions, but to be fair as we can. So in the middle, for example, we're saying the question, is intensive and extensive good or bad? Well, some believe that intensive animal agricultural systems are too industrial and inhumane, preferring extensive choices. Others say intensive systems use resources more efficiently, produce less methane, and if well managed, can give good animal welfare. So the idea is to try to get different perspectives. It's just an example. Here are the cluster cards I mentioned, and here are the voting sheets. The voting sheets, we're asking how important are 5 different applications of cattle breeding? Production efficiency, better disease resistance, reduced methane emissions, increasing a cow's productive lifetime, and adaptation towards different sorts of environments. And the sort of responses we got back from this and from other questions we were raising, in summary, there was a high value to cattle welfare and the feeling that breeding should be for the benefit of the animal, not just humans. Better disease resistance was the most frequently cited of those 5 goals. Interestingly, there was support for improved production if it meant particularly using less animals, because that would mean less environmental impact, particularly in terms of methane, but provided animal welfare was respected in the process. Methane emissions had a distinctly nuanced sort of mixed viewpoint. A sort of yes, but. Some people said, well, you know, you've exaggerated the impact anyway. There's too much cow talk about methane, somebody said. Other ones said, well, shouldn't feed changes or just using less cattle be more effective than breeding changes? And the point was made by a few, if you do change the metabolism, you should be very concerned not to harm the cattle. Increasing a lifetime, I think people didn't entirely understand what was meant by that, but I think particularly the idea was, if it means better welfare for the animal, then yes, but some saw it as the opposite way around, seeing it as more instrumentalization of cattle, maybe feeling we've already gone too far down a kind of industrial route. So a variety of perspectives came out. We also had several people who are just opposed to cattle breeding at all, but they play the game and they were prepared to actually give their views, which was in itself quite encouraging. One of the more interesting ones was elite cattle, or cattle more adapted to their environment, particularly changed environments in future. And some, I think more than others, went for the idea of adaptation, but some said, no, elites is very important, and some said both. So that's a range of the particular publics we talked to. Another question we asked was about, are there moral limits? And everyone said pretty much yes, mostly to do with welfare. elite and robust cattle I've dealt with. Genome editing had a surprisingly positive viewpoint. Some said, no, we shouldn't do this, but in general, we felt that was much better supported than we were expecting, provided it was well researched and properly sort of tested. And the last thing we asked was, how much are you willing to pay extra for more ethically produced minced beef as a basic sort of food, steak as a special meal, milk, and a special cheese. And the 4 categories with lower methane emissions, with healthier cattle, with more disease-resistant and pasture-fed. And the results that came out of this were quite interesting. The biggest support came from people said they were prepared to spend 10 or 20% more of their sort of on healthier cattle. And likewise, very similar for resistant and likewise pasture-fed. Methane was somewhat less supported, but these are not hard figures. As I said before, please treat this as being rather just what these particular groups of people considered. So we had a relatively small number of people. There were self-selecting groups. The technical term was, in terms of the way we sampled, was just simply based on those who we could find who would play. The data are mainly qualitative, but they are giving you some thoughts about areas where people might want to follow up in future. And we suggest at the end of our deliverable that this could actually be applied to other areas of livestock breeding, including fish. So there's some areas to follow up in depth here, we think, on this sort of first cut. So I want to thank my wife and Anne, who is online, for all her work on this. And to say that you've all got a copy of the game, I hope, courtesy of, thank you very much, Emily, for getting it all organised to get it there. If you want to play it with people, please talk to me if you want to, or Anne and I, about how to do it. But the idea is to play ideally with publics, but also you could play it with your research students and so forth, because it also has a function as a pedagogical tool, raising some of these wider issues. So it has both aspects.
Thank you very much, Donald and Koen. We started a little bit late, so I could allow for 1 or 2 questions, please.
Jose Espinosa from the CRG. So might be a question for Koen, but not sure. So how do you think these concerns about breeding should permeate the society? It should be something that goes from academia to the society, or the other way around? And also, another thing is, what about developing countries? Because I guess that in these countries, it's more difficult to focus in these kind of ethical issues because they probably are more focused in economical issues. So what is your take on that? And if there is any study about difference between, I don't know, Europe countries and developing countries?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Ideally, the communication between academia and citizens should be a two-way communication, not a one-way from academia to citizens, in the sense that the reason you're involving citizens it is not just to explain them what you have done and to find support for what you have done, but hopefully also to learn from the views, the ethical views of people like citizens, but also stakeholders more widely. So you can include that reflectively also in what academia is about. So it can be questions like, so what should be the breeding goals for the next couple of years, for example. So yeah, ideally that would be a dialogue and not the academia telling citizens what the right approach is, or something like that.
In the crisis on genetically modified food, the assumption had been that all the scientists need to do is to tell the public and they'll think it's wonderful. And that what was known as the deficit model of public communication has been heavily criticized ever since, because it doesn't work, because people have got values themselves and they would like to tell you what they think. And I think and hence the game and other approaches similarly are really wanting to say, okay, how much does what are being thought by people in a sense with only the technology around them, how widely is that reflecting what the public thinks? And of course, how do you find 200 million people's view is a very difficult view. So how to democratize this is an ongoing issue. But you know, these are all components that help out, we hope.
Yeah. And there, your second question about more an international perspective and how about more developing countries is, of course, a very much complicating matter because breeding is, of course, transnational or global. Yeah, where you might, on the one hand, want to breed for the values of one community. Breeding is often much more, more globalized. Although I think that a project like this, if I understood correctly, may also contribute to breeding more local varieties, which also reflect then maybe more local values.
Okay, I think as this indicates, we could have discussions for a very long time, but we have to stick to the time. Koen, Donald, thank you very much, and thanks for the discussion.